This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 31 of season 2 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, July 31st, 1909. I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford 114 years ago. The first section in the July 31st issue is the About Town section. The new forest fire laws are being enforced by Forest Fire Warden John A. Healy and Constable Edson G. Boynton, and two Lowell men, Joseph Emmons and John Morrow, were arrested last week Friday and placed in the lockup. And the Saturday following, they were tried at Ayer, found guilty, and Judge Atwood thought best to warn other lawmakers and breakers in this line of business, and so, figuratively speaking, this warning was hoisted $15 each. Mr. Emmons owns the land, but the new law will not allow the owner to start a fire without a permit. This curtailment of liberty is to make room for justice. There has been too much irresponsible free use of the match and axe, hence laws and fines. George C. Moore, with his characteristic foresight, caution, has recently built two hose houses for fire emergencies, one opposite the Brookside Mills and the other on Brookside Road opposite his tenement houses. George Moore was the proprietor of the Brookside Mills for a number of years before he sold them to Abbott Worsted Company. C.R.P. Decatur, while mowing in Tadmuck Meadow near the Lowell Road on Monday, killed a black snake measuring 7 feet. Its running mate, which ran and escaped, measured 9 feet by running measure. He was running northward. His front business end must have got there by this time, although he may not be all out of the meadow yet. Mrs. Luke Fletcher, well known as a resident of Westford for many years, by an accidental misstep, fell downstairs at the Hotel Hamlet in Somerville, which is kept by Mrs. George Dupee, also a former resident of Westford. The Dupee House in Westford is the old colonial home on the left side of Carlisle Road, just across that road's intersection with Acton Road as you head toward Carlisle. At a recent meeting of the Massachusetts Historical Society, ex-Governor John D. Long gave some interesting, quote, reminiscences of my 70 years education, end quote, wherein he speaks of his life at Westford. He says, after leaving college, he graduated from Harvard, I taught 2 years in an academy at Westford, Mass. This was an admirable education for me, for I was now compelled to convey instead of receiving. I read and wrote and had delightful and valuable associations in social life, end quote. And he loved Westford indeed, and often returned to Westford on holidays and often to be the featured speaker at various ceremonies in town. Oscar A. Davis on the Leland Road has had removed the past week the bodies of his two sisters from Keene, New Hampshire to Westford in Fairview Cemetery. They were buried in Keene nearly 40 years ago. The tablet accompanied the removal. I think by tablet he means the tombstone. This removal was to fulfill the desire of near relatives. By an unexpected change in plans, the Westford ball team will play the third game of the series with the Nashua team at Nashua this afternoon. Of the two games played, Westford won the first by score of 4-2, July 5th, and lost the second game 5-3, so that the game will be full of glory for someone. The Nashua team claims the championship of New Hampshire. Quote, we are tending tonight on the old campground, end quote. This is the familiar first line of the Civil War song written by Walter Kittredge, the minstrel of Merrimack, New Hampshire, who wrote over 500 songs. Sam Taylor goes on to say, that is just what they are doing those warm mosquito nights at the old Oak and Bucket farm, that is at his farm on the Lowell Road. Westford Grange will hold its next regular meeting Thursday evening, August 5th, when the following questions will be discussed. Pure Food Victories of the Past 5 Years is the title of the first one. Also, the question laid over from a former meeting, quote, from which do we derive the most benefit, education or observation, end quote. On this question, Reverend Charles P. Marshall will speak for the education, and Samuel L. Taylor will observe. In accordance with law and facts, J. Willard Fletcher and William L. Woods were appointed by the selectmen to repair with cash the damage done by deer on Francis Hill, and attended to that duty Tuesday, accompanied by the selectmen. Wonder what they appraised those barberry bushes at. The next section is called Contract Let. Colonel Metcalf writes Captain Sherman Fletcher that he has let the contract for the new monument to the Harrison Granite Company of New York City. The front of the monument will have the GIR badge and the numerals 1861-1865, and underneath, tribute to Westford volunteers who knew no glory but their country's good, end quote. On the other side will be inscribed, quote, presented to the town of Westford by Edwin D. Metcalf of Auburn, New York, son of Lieutenant William Metcalf, Westford's first volunteer, 1861, end quote. In connection with the movement for this monument, the selectmen have got a timely patriotic move on them and held a meeting Thursday evening when the following citizens were appointed to act with the selectmen in arranging the details for the erection and dedication of this monument. Captain Sherman H. Fletcher, George T. Day, Edward Fisher, Wesley O. Hawks, and Julian A. Cameron. This committee are eminently representative of progressive patriotism and the power of aesthetic influence in their actions and by their environments. Behold the evidence, quote, by their fruits you shall know them, end quote. The next section is called More Deer. A large deer was seen Monday harvesting corn on Francis Hill near Chamberlain's blacksmith shop, at 70 Chamberlain Road. Complaints have come from Mrs. Alice Holt, the estate of Noah Prescott, John H. Keefe, Eben Prescott, and Alexander Courtney of damage done by deer. It was reported that they make a rendezvous in the barberry orchard of Samuel L. Taylor on Francis Hill. That is right, dear, that's D-E-A-R-D-E-E-R. You shan't be molested if you eat all those deer barberries up. But mind you, if you wish me to continue in the deer mood, please leave that acre of buckwheat alone that skirts the rising run westerly of the barberries that hide the sun. Pity that the state is so rich in wasteland that she can't afford a park, but is so poor in judgment that the whole state is dedicated to a fenceless park. I don't know why he thinks a fenced-in area for deer would keep them from proliferating throughout the state. The next section is the center section. Mrs. Fred A. Hildreth has been a guest this week at H.V. Hildreth's. Mr. and Mrs. Charles L. Hildreth have been enjoying a week's vacation at Ipswich. Mrs. Charles P. Marshall and daughter Marion leave this Saturday for their annual sojourn at her childhood home at Gorham, New Hampshire, and later to Dover. The J.V. Fletcher Library will continue to close Sundays through the month of August. Town Treasurer Naaman H. Wright has been on the sick list this last week, but has improved and hopes to be about again soon. Edwin L. Bliss, M.D., of Fuzhou, China, occupied the pulpit Sunday morning at the Congregational Church and gave an excellent address on, quote, medical missions in China, end quote. Arthur E. Day has been suffering with an injured hand. The accident happened while he was examining some machinery at the sergeant shop in Graniteville. Mrs. Oscar R. Spaulding is entertaining friends at camp this week. The camps of the Westford colony on the shore of Forge Pond are all occupied, and life there is most enjoyable just now. Oscar Spaulding and his wife lived in Westford Center, but had a cottage on Forge Pond, as did many others. The cottages were located both on the Westford shore and on the Littleton shore of the pond. Miss Nettie Stevens of Mountain View, California, is renewing some of the former pleasant associations of Westford. At present, she is the guest of Miss Emily F. Fletcher. Nettie Stevens is one of the most famous women to graduate from Westford Academy, graduated in 1880. She then graduated from Westfield Normal School and became preceptress of Westford Academy from 1885 to 1892. She later went to Stanford University, where she obtained an A.B. degree in 1899 and an A.M. degree in 1900 in biology. In 1903, she got her Ph.D. degree from Bryn Mawr College, where she studied cellular-level topics like cell division, cell regeneration, and the development of sperm and eggs. She continued researching and teaching at Bryn Mawr, where she discovered for the first time that the presence of the Y chromosome carried by the sperm cell was responsible for sex determination. This discovery provided a firm link between Mendelian and chromosomal theories of inheritance, and for the first time proved the chromosomal difference between the X and Y sex chromosomes. Graniteville is the next section. Mrs. Sherman, wife of Dr. Warren H. Sherman of this village, is now visiting relatives in Daramuscata, Maine for a few weeks. O.A. Nelson and A.R. Wall enjoyed a very pleasant automobile trip over the famous racing course in Lowell and Tingsboro last Saturday afternoon as the guests of Edward B. Carney in his Buick car. There was a road race that was run in Lowell, and I think the course was something like 2 or 3 miles long. Many people from this village will attend the St. John's Church Parish Picnic to be held at Damnasset Grove next Saturday. Sam, the old white workhorse that has been with the Abbott Worsted Company for so long that he seems to be a fixture of the plant, died suddenly of acute indigestion on last Sunday morning after a few hours' illness. This horse has been a familiar sight in our village streets 6 out of the 7 days of the week for several years, and it will seem strange not to see him about as usual. The firm had the horse taken away and buried on Sunday. Thomas Rafferty, the well-known stone man, will leave here this week for Georgia, where he has accepted a lucrative position as foreman on a large building job. He will be absent several months. Henry Leduc, a machinist in the employ of C.G. Sargent's sons here, got his finger cut very badly while at work on a job for the firm in Lawrence on last Saturday, and the injury will keep him from work for several days. He was probably installing a textile machinery that C.G. Sargent and Sons had sold to one of the mills in Lawrence. Albert Reeves, whose store in Graniteville serves as a waiting room for the Lowell and Fitchburg Electric Road, has been granted a victualler's license by the selectmen of Westford, and his store will be open as usual on Sundays, but the sales will be limited to tonics, ice cream, confectionery, and cigars, also papers. The next section is called baseball. The Graniteville Blues visited West Chelmsford on last Saturday afternoon, and for the second time this season defeated the West Chelmsfords in a very exciting 11-inning baseball game by the score of 13-11. Owing to the many errors on the part of the Blues, the West Chelmsford boys scored many runs in the first part of the game, and at the beginning of the 9th inning, the score stood 9-4 in West Chelmsford favor. The Blues then got busy, and by timely batting, aided by a few errors on the part of their opponents, they tied the score amid great excitement among the fans. In the first of the 11th, West Chelmsford got men on first and second bases at different times, but they were caught napping by the Blues pitcher and put out in short order. The third man then struck out, and Graniteville took the game home in their inside pocket. These teams will not play again this season, Graniteville winning the series. This game will give the natives something to talk about for several days, for the West Chelmsford boys would rather win a game from Graniteville than any other team in the league. I guess that means the Forgeville or the Westford Granite or Chelmsford sports rivalry goes back at least 100 years. probably longer. The next section is the Forge Village section. The Forge Village Lions defeated the Iroquois of Lowell on the home grounds Saturday afternoon by the score of 10-4. Although the weather was rather unfavorable, there was a large crowd of people in attendance and the game lasted 2 hours. Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Mason's little son, who was born on June 10, 1909, was christened Clayton Hartman at St. Andrew's Mission Sunday afternoon by Reverend Thomas L. Fisher. Herbert Mason and Miss Emily Catchpole stood sponsors. Mrs. Sadie and Louise Morton, who have been visiting with their uncle, George Kugel, were unexpectedly called to their home, Bridgeport, Connecticut, Saturday. Miss Emma Murray accompanied them to visit her sister, Mrs. William Morton. Joseph Mason has resigned his position as with Abbott Company for one of the Lowell machine shops, and family intends to move to Lowell very soon. 6 new cottages are being built on Pond Street. They will be ready for occupancy by the 1st of September. Mr. and Mrs. Jackson have gone to Bangor, Maine for a few weeks. William Blodgett of the Ridges fell from a load of hay Monday and was quite seriously injured. Master Herbert Holt of Andover is visiting his aunt, Mrs. R.D. Prescott. Miss Plummer has gone to Salem for a short visit. Miss Grace Lawrence is visiting her aunt, Mrs. Edward Prescott, in Westford. Mrs. A.W. Karkin is spending a few days in Gardner with her son, Alan. That's the news in Westford for the week ending July 31st, 1909. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Nick Woodbury of Westford Cat for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.